All right, Matt. Well, we have a pretty interesting topic today. I think it's very apropos with everything that's going on with COVID and so on. So we have today Matt DelVecchio, who's here with us. Matt, just to give you a bit of his background, he's president of Lianas Incorporated. Matt is a certified professional consultant on aging, CPCA. He is the owner of Lianas Services, retirement, home search, and transition support. He is also host of a weekly radio show called Life Unrehearsed on CJAD800, which is at 4 o'clock on Sundays. And he's a monthly columnist with the Senior Times newspaper. Now, on top of it, I've known Matt for easily 15 years. Both of our children went and obviously went to the same school and so on. And I met Matt through some charity work and so on. And I just think he's a great person. So I'm really, really happy to have him today with us. So Matt, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Marco. I really appreciate it.
So a lot going on. As you know, there was actually an article this morning in La Presse saying that people who passed, who actually died from COVID-19, 81% of the people who died of COVID-19 in Canada came from long-term care facilities. We are the worst country in the world regarding that. Obviously, it's a huge subject right now. Matt, when we're going to get to retirement and you know, all we think about is you know, taking those trips and playing golf and doing a lot of recreation things and so on. But why don't you help us identify the typical continuum as we age and we go from 65 to 75 and to 85 and so on?
Sure. No, I think that would be a good idea, sort of to set the foundation as to my day-to-day world with a lot of the clients that we have. And typically, here's how it would go. First of all, everyone will want to stay at home for as long as possible. And home could be at the physical home, the family home. It could be in a condo. It could be in an apartment. And as one ages, your care requirements increase. Could both be physical or cognitive care. So what normally would happen would be you'd want to still stay at home and arm yourself with a little bit of home care that could either be done through the public system, and a lot of the time it's done by family or privately. And then when the next stage after that, once care becomes a little too much at home, and by the way, at home, you could even do home renovations to keep yourself in the home as long as possible, make that bathroom safer and kitchen and maybe even all on one floor. But eventually care gets to a point where it might not be safe to be at home. It might be a little bit too much overwhelming for the family or a spouse. And the next step after that is most likely in some form of a senior's residence. And that industry, Marco, is changing rapidly. Okay, we might think of seniors residence as being those nursing homes or CHSLDs. Well, there's a whole other industry, which we call RPAs in Quebec, where you could have kind of the best of both worlds. You could live your autonomous living, yet you have all the services and amenities from a nurse there or a doctor that will come occasionally. You'll have the dining area, the convenience stores and pharmacies. So that's a good sort of interim step. After that, once your care becomes too much, and the way the general rule of thumb, Margot, is once care exceeds more than 3 hours every single day, and that could be assistance with getting dressed, assistance with bathing, maybe even managing medication properly, maybe assistance with mobility and even eating. Now we're talking long-term care in the form of a nursing home. In Quebec, it's a CHSLD. And that's the highest level of care that we can get. And then the very, very last stage, we would know that as palliative care. And that's in the latter stages, the last stages of life. So we see that starting in your 70s and as you're aging, 80s and 90s, you go through these various continuum of care.
Okay. Matt, one of the things that, and I remember my father actually said this to me, he said, Marco, when I'm going to be at a point where there's nothing you can do with me, just pull the plug and everything. And it's a very simplistic way of looking at life and saying, okay, well, when that comes, just take care of it type of thing. But obviously things are not as simple as that. And it's when you get to that point, it's another thing and everything. Matt, what are you seeing right now? What are you seeing working with clients who are, at that point and getting to that point, and in the last year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of their lives, what exactly are you seeing there?
Yeah, and I'll back it up a little bit, because a lot of these conversations actually start with the boomers. So those that are in their 50s or 60s, and we're seeing what's going on, this terrible situation with CHSLDs and long-term care, and a lot of the adult children that I'm dealing with, you hear the phrase, I'm not going to be like that. Forget it. Just pull the plug. I hear that all the time. Unfortunately, the reality of what actually plays out is, if you're going to be in a pull the plug situation, that is in your very last breathing days, where care is at an extreme level. The toughest part of aging is not retirement. People look forward to retirement. We look forward to, in normal times, traveling and enjoying our lives. It's those last 3, 5, 7 years where care levels become quite high, and you just can't pull the plug. It's not realistic to think that, but you have to deal with it. You have to be able to manage that. And this is where costs and financial planning actually come into play, because the cost of care increases as you age, and it could get quite costly in those latter stages of life. So it's important to acknowledge that care, you have no choice. Your care needs will increase. And it's important to recognize in those last few years, these are the crucial years that almost everyone will get to, and we'll have to address that in terms of costs, in terms of communicating with family what you want.
Let's talk about that, costs and everything, because when I meet clients and we talk about their retirement, the first thing that they talk about is, look, Marco, we're going to need money from age 65 to probably 80. And after the age of 80, look, we're not going to spend a lot of money. We're not going to be doing a lot of traveling. We're going to eat less, whatever. We're not going to need as much money. And I will tell you, and not just the last months or whatever, but I would say the last few years and everything, I felt uncomfortable with that conversation that clients have had with me, because I think a lot of what they're saying is wishful thinking. We're hoping that it's not going to cost us a lot of money, because we are assuming that we will be healthy and we won't need a lot of things, and like you're alluding to, and so on. So it's funny, but I don't see it that way as a financial planner, and as a retirement planner, I see it very, very differently. Matt, maybe just give us an idea of what does it cost actually? I mean, and I think right now, a lot of people in their minds are saying, hey, I'm going to stay in my home as long as possible. This is what I want to do. Don't want to go to that CHSLD. Don't want it. So if you could break it down to us, let's say I wanted to decide to live home and so on, but I do have needs and so on, what would that cost?
Yeah, it's one of the number one questions I get, Marco, is how much is this going to cost? How much do I have to prepare for? So I think what would be best is to let's break it down on that continuum of care that I just talked about, and what it costs for each of those levels. So for example, at a retirement, you're living off your retirement and your savings in the plan, and sitting down with your financial planner. Now you're going to start to incur some costs because of additional care needs. And to reduce those costs, what a lot of people do is they take advantage of the public system that we have. So if we're here specifically in Quebec or the rest of Canada, a lot of home care support is offered by the public system, the CLSC here in Quebec. The challenge, though, is that system, as we're seeing, I don't want to say it's broken, but it's pretty close to being broken. You no matter what, and it's inevitable. I'm dealing with caseworkers from the CLSC and families all the time. Families want more care at home than what is actually being offered, or than what is actually being given by the CLSC. So we have to realize that your wish list of care is most likely not going to happen. If you need an hour or 2 or 5 hours a day of care, we cannot rely totally on the public system to take care of that. So what many families do is they top it off with some private home care. Some families say, forget it. I'm not fighting with the public system. I get a different caregiver all the time. I'm just going to go private home care right off the bat. To give you an idea of costs, and I'm talking what non-nursing, this is more companionship, helping out with day-to-day activities, the going rate is somewhere between $26 to $30 an hour if you want to go private. So, multiply that out. You want 3 hours a day times 7 days a week. There's 21 hours at about, I'm going to use at the low end, being ultra conservative, $25. You're looking at $500-600 a week for private home care. That's $2,500 range on a monthly basis for home care. Now, as mentioned, home care could also, don't forget about some of the renovation costs that you might incur. You may need a ramp on the outside. You may now have mom and or dad on one level of a floor. You may have to add bars in the bathroom, solid bars. You may have to adjust the kitchen. So there's some additional expenses to put you in a position to live at home safely. If it gets to a point where it's too much living at home, both from a cost perspective, a care perspective, caregiver stress is a big issue. It's too overwhelming. Now, normally you would either go into a residence or in a nursing home. So I'll explain the cost for those two. If you want it, you can't go into a public seniors residence. The only thing available publicly is long-term care home. But as I mentioned before, there's a whole market for seniors residences. You want the best of both worlds, where you can live in a regular apartment, a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, get your meals, get some care, usually up to about 3 hours. That will range anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 a month to live in a seniors residence that is going to offer some care. And why there's a big variation, it depends on room size, whether you're getting meals, and how much care you need. But plan on between $2,000 and $5,000. The last stage, Marco, long-term care, nursing homes, you have 2 options. Public system, that's the same rate across Quebec. It's usually the same rate whether you're in Ontario or Quebec. What I mean by same rate, if you're in Quebec, a private room in a nursing home, a CHSLD, is $1,948 a month. Say $1,950, almost $2,000 a month. And it's all in. Everything's covered. In Ontario, it's about $2,500 a month for a private room. So to give you a range. Some families saying, Matt, you've seen the news. I don't want my loved one, or I don't want to go to a CHSLD. In Quebec, we're fortunate that there are private options for CHSLD as well. You don't have a private option for long-term care in Ontario and many other provinces. The going rate in private CHSLDs are about $5,000 a month. Okay, so that will give you a range. There are some very high-end ones. Now you can get into $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a month for high care needs. They do exist, but generally speaking, long-term care, nursing home, if you want to go private, you're looking at about $5,000 per month.
Wow. Okay. So that kind of, and that puts a perspective on all the planning issue, beyond 80 and everything, and how are we going to pay for that, and so on. By the way, before I continue, for people who are obviously listening to this webinar today, there's a chat feature on Zoom that you can, and I'm sorry if I didn't mention that, but you can ask your questions, and we will either ask them as we go along, or we'll ask them at the end, but please feel free to use the chat button, and there you go. There are other questions, and questions are popping into my mind, Matt, about, there's a couple of things I want to ask you. The first thing is, let's say I wanted to stay in my home and I wanted to have some type of care and so on. And you were mentioning it's $26 to $30 an hour to have somebody come home and everything. How easy is it today to find people who can do that? Is there a lot of people that actually do this work? How easy or difficult is it to get somebody? If I want to pick up the phone or go on the website, how easy or difficult is it to get somebody like that?
Yeah, in fact, I get asked that question quite a bit, Matt. We're not quite ready for a residence, but we need some help at home. So we refer to that as the private home care industry. It is very competitive. It is increasingly competitive, and you do have lots of options. I couldn't say that a few months ago when we were really heavy into COVID, because there were a lot of caregivers and workers in the home care industry that were infected and they could not work. So the pool of caregivers went down significantly. But in normal times, not a problem. In the private home care industry, you have lots of options. There are several very, very good companies that could offer from companionship all the way up to nursing care, where you may need injections and there may be diabetes with insulin and so on. So it's quite competitive. There's always options.
Okay. Another question is it's all about preparation. Either we prepare the right way once we get to a situation where we will have a long-term care situation. And often I find that there are some families that have an easier time discussing about that eventuality than other families. And I'd like you to give me an example of people that you've met, because you've met a lot of people. You must have a ton of stories and everything, but can you give me an example of some people that prepared it the right way and did a good job, to that eventuality vis-a-vis others where it was just a disaster?
Yeah, and I'm dealing with both ends of the spectrum and everything in between. Okay, so I'll give two real examples that happen. One is the general attitude of, you know what, I'm going to deal with it when it happens, and inevitably it happens, and they are not prepared. They are not prepared. They're not able to make decisions on their terms. They haven't planned properly, and guess what? The individual is not in a good position, but more importantly, their children are usually stuck with some of the challenges of having to deal with the care of mom or dad. At the other end, we deal with families where they have been proactive, where mom or dad, a couple have said, you know what, we do not want to put the burden of care on our children. We want to address it right now. So they are starting to plan early because they don't want their kids to worry about them as they age. So what we see, a couple quick recommendations, Marco. First and foremost, one of the most important things you can do is start communicating with your family. One of the biggest issues I have, Marco, actually, is I'm hearing from the children, my parents don't want to spend their money. In other words, and it makes sense, think about it. People born in their 20s, 30s, and 40s have been a generation of savers. They usually came from nothing and worked very hard to grow their nest egg. And they want to be able to pass that on to their children. And I get a lot of children saying, I can't get through to them. They don't want to spend their money because they want to leave us some money. And we're saying, Ma, Dad, spend the money. This will be rectified with good family conversations. We get issues with a cottage where, we got to maintain the cottage because we have to pass that down to the kids. And the kids are saying, we don't want the cottage. Thank you. But, important conversation. Do you want to have help at home with extra home care, with burdening family members to help? Or are you okay to go into a residence or a long-term care home and armed with some additional support? So these are important conversations. And I would also add, get your legal work intact. And Marco, you see this, I'm sure, more often than even me. Wills, power of attorney, protection mandates, get those organized. I highly encourage long-term care insurance. When we talked about that good scenario where someone's saying, I don't want to put the burden on my children, those that have long-term care insurance already in place, they're saying, okay, I'm good. I'm covered. I don't have to put this burden on my children. So I would highly encourage looking into long-term care insurance, especially if you're in your 50s, even 40s, 60s, but these aren't conversations at 80. You need to be having these conversations in your 50s and 60s with yourselves or with your folks?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that eventually. One question that I have for you, and again, you were talking about the conversations that you have, that you need to have with your parents about this stuff and so on. And I think we generally want to have conversations that are going to take 10 minutes, right? We don't want them to take a long time. Matt, when you start having these conversations with your parents, I mean, obviously this is such a huge decision, you know, about how do you see your future and so on. When you have these conversations with mom and dad and everything, what time frame should you kind of give everyone to kind of come to a consensus of this is how we see things going? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can't just go, you know, Sunday night supper. Hey, by the way, let's talk about your long-term care. I mean, I don't even know. It's got to be so difficult to just approach the subject. What recommendations would you give? I mean, and the time frame and so on.
Yeah, and in fact, the time frame, it's not going to be a one-shot deal. There is a process. You need to start planting seeds. And we always suggest look for trigger events. And I'm talking about either the parents or even the adult children, trigger events. It could be, I don't know, a diagnosis at a doctor. There might be some beginning of memory care loss. There might have been a slip and a fall and a broken hip, forgetting to take meds. A trigger event could be a neighbor. Something happened to a neighbor or a family member where you use that event as a trigger event. Hey, look what happened to John. My goodness, what if that happened to you, mom or dad? That's a trigger event. I would encourage talking to the family doctor, your general practitioner. They could be very influential on, you know, you should start preparing some of these things as well. So always look for trigger events to start a conversation. Believe me, it's not one conversation, it's going to be multiple conversations. But the uneasiness of these conversations, because let's face it, these are difficult, challenging conversations, gets simpler as you have more and more of those conversations, because you're going to have to get into the weeds and have some of these tough conversations. It just can't happen like that.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you right away, I feel uneasiness doing this webinar today. And you know, I felt that I had to do it because it's an issue right now in our societies. It's a worldwide thing. And I really feel as a financial planner that I have to address this more and more to my clients. And when I start talking, Matt, about long-term care insurance, it's almost as difficult as discussing when I first had my conversation with my mother, whatever. It's the same difficulty because most of my clients, they're okay. So you're kind of telling them, you know, one day you're not going to be okay. Do you want this insurance for that? And and here we are, you know, we're helping our clients save money for 30, 40, 50 years. They get to their retirement, and we shouldn't be having these discussions, but we must at the same time. And I want to get back to what you were mentioning, which was people do not want to spend their money for this stuff, right? And I kind of understand the psychology behind that, because people have been saving all their lives. So when they get to the retirement, they've got to change their mindsets and spend the money and so on. What I'm finding out is that people do not want to, you know, take the money that they saved for this stuff. And I think this is where long-term care insurance comes in. Rather than having your assets pay for your care, why don't you have the insurance company pay for that, you know, for pennies on the dollar? And by the way, yes, the premiums are high, especially if you take them at 50 or 60. But once they start getting paid, and it doesn't take a long time for you to recoup all, you know, the premiums that you paid and so on and so forth. So there's a planning that needs to be done around that, but it's so complicated. It's a complicated issue. I'm going to look if we have some questions. Anything you want to add to what I just mentioned, Matt?
To what you're saying, I think it's an important point. We summarize it very simple: proactive versus reactive. And believe me, I've been in those situations more time than not in reactive. dealing with it. Could you imagine getting a call from a daughter saying, Mom's at the hospital and the doctor says she can't live at home anymore. Matt, find me a place on Wednesday. You don't want to be in those positions. Be proactive. Have those conversations in the earlier years so you're ready to address if something were to come about like that.
Yeah, without a question. And in our industry, it's so easy not to address this because I'm going to be 56 this year, and I could argue, oh, I don't have to talk about it with Matt DelVecchio about getting this long-term care insurance because in 20, 30 years, who knows what I'm going to be doing then. But if I didn't recommend long-term care insurance to Matt, it's not my problem anymore, and I could be. See, this is wrong. It's wrong to think this way because we have to think long-term for our clients all the time, and it's never ending. Matt, one question we were discussing yesterday, a couple of things and so on, and I asked you point blank, what is the percentage right now? Your estimate. I mean, you've been doing this and so on. What is the percentage of people that will need some type of long-term care before they die? Do you have a general idea about that? What would you say it is?
Right. So I don't have a factual scientific number for you, Marco, but here's the reality. Unless you suddenly pass away due to stroke, heart attack, struck by lightning, or hit by a bus, almost everyone is going to require some form of long-term care. And that could either, when I talk about long-term care, it could still mean at home. You're going to require additional care. Eventually, if you're not at home, you're going to require to live in a long-term care residence. That is going to cost money, no matter which way you look at it. It will also cost resources of family members. And that's an important one because there's dollars, and I've seen people who have lots of money, but the children are still stressed. They're not able to cope with the additional care levels because they weren't prepared. So I think the best way to approach it is assume you're going to require care, the vast, vast majority, unless something happens suddenly. You're going to have to deal with care at one point in your lives as you age. It's almost, it's guaranteed you're going to require that.
Right. Matt, and maybe this is a difficult question for you because we're in this, I guess, turmoil or storm, or call it what you may. What do you think is the future of where care is going and so on? How do you see it play out, like in 3, 5, 10 years? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, if we're specifically addressing the topic of long-term care, and you mentioned at the outset with this article, we're proud to be Canadians. We just had Canada Day, but we should not be proud of our track record. 81% of deaths due to COVID were in long-term care. So if there is a silver lining, it's that long-term care will improve. Is it going to be solved? No way, Marco. It's not going to be solved. There is so much work that needs to get done, but it will improve. Little examples. And I'll give 2 separate examples. One, to help prevent infection control is the industry needs to start hiring full-time people. The reason why COVID spread so rampantly is that the caregivers were going from home to home to home and spreading it unknowingly. So hire full-time people to work at one location. That will help the spread. At the other end of it, the government, taxpayers, you and me need to be ready to invest more time, money, and resources, and unfortunately that means tax dollars, to improve long-term care. For example, one of the biggest things they can do right away is improve the staff to resident ratio to help with the care, to make care a little bit more dignified, because today it's not. What I mean by that, if you've got one caregiver taking care of 12, 15 people, getting them dressed every morning, helping them with toileting, helping them with eating, they cannot do it. It's like cattle. If you could bring those ratios down to 1 to 5, 1 to 6, it's much more manageable. That's going to cost some money to do that, but the quality of care will increase.
100%. 100%. There are no questions in the chat feature. Any questions you have for me, Matt?
No, I'm, hats off to you, Marco, because there aren't too many people, particularly in wealth planning, financial planning, that deal with the latter part of life. Most focus in on retirement and let's save and how are we going to be. But you're addressing a very important topic that everyone's going to have to manage. And we've known each other for a while. You've never been afraid to address the tough questions with your clients. And I like that, because even though I'll feel uncomfortable and oh boy, I don't know if I want to have these conversations, you have to have these conversations, and hats off to you for addressing it, as uncomfortable as it may be. So thank you for having me on and dealing with an important topic.
Thanks, Matt. And the one thing that I want to address in the end, number one, if you need Matt's help, I mean, again, it's Lianas Services. He's great, and he's just a great human being. I mean, he would not be on my webinar if I did not think that for a second. The other thing too is I will be talking to my clients about all these issues, because this is, and I want to incorporate it in the planning. I think planning has to change. Planning has to not assume that everybody's going to be fine after 80. There's got to be more what ifs in the plan. So for those who have been on this webinar today, just so that you know, it will be available eventually on our website. And please feel free to share the information to some people who don't want to talk about this, but feel it would be a good idea to kind of have the information. And Matt, I want to thank you for the time that you gave me today. And I know I'll be talking to you soon, as I usually do.
Well, thank you for having me, Marco. I really do appreciate it.
All right. Have a great day.